And it is a big risk, not only because, he's presenting an Israeli proposal, but he's putting pressure on his regional allies to get Hamas to come to the table. And should either party reject this, the question is what happens next? What's his next move?
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On Friday, May 31st, President Biden made a surprising announcement about a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Biden laid out the terms of this three-phased cessation of hostilities and said that the deal was proposed by Israel and sent to Hamas. The optics of a U.S. president making public what he said was an Israeli proposal made many people question whether or not Israel was fully behind this deal. Meanwhile, Biden aimed much of his remarks at Hamas, urging them to accept this ostensibly Israeli deal. At time of recording, Hamas has neither accepted nor rejected this proposal. My guest today, Joel Braunold, is managing director of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace. We kick off discussing what is included in this ceasefire agreement before having a long conversation about the reactions and responses to the Biden announcement by Hamas and Israel. We spend a good deal of time discussing some of the motivations behind Hamas's approach to a ceasefire deal and the complex domestic politics in Israel around this deal. I mentioned this in the episode, but we are now closer to a ceasefire deal than probably we have been at any point since the start of these hostilities on October 7th. So actions by these key players over the next several days and weeks is really consequential to whether or not there will be a meaningful reduction of hostilities in Gaza. At the same time, increasing tensions on Israel's northern border and in Lebanon also seem to suggest that the prospect of a wider regional war is very much still a potential outcome here. Needless to say, these next several days and weeks are very pivotal, and this conversation will give you the context you need to understand events as they unfold. So I have one very exciting announcement to make. You might have already seen this, but in case you have not, I am launching a brand new podcast about the United Nations. It's called To Save Us from Hell. It'll be a weekly chat show in which my co-host, Anjali Dayal, and I discuss the latest news and happenings at the United Nations. I am a journalist who's covered the UN for nearly 20 years. Anjali is an academic who studies and teaches the United Nations, and together we will bring you insights, news, and analysis of all things United Nations on a weekly basis. There is nothing like this out there in the podcast universe. I am really, really excited for this show's launch. To Save Us from Hell is a project of Global Dispatches, and it will be a premium offering for paid subscribers to Global Dispatches. To access full episodes of To Save Us from Hell, please visit globaldispatches.org and sign up for a paid subscription. You can follow the link in the show notes of this episode as well. I am really excited, and we will see you there. For now, here is my conversation with Joel Braunold of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace. Joel, thanks so much for speaking with me. So to kick off, can you just lay out what Biden said in his speech last Friday? What are the broad details of this ceasefire proposal?
Sure, Mark, thanks for having me. President Biden on Friday released, in his words, the Israeli acceptance of an Israeli proposal. That confusion will become clarified. Of an Israeli ceasefire proposal, which is a three-phrase proposal, which A, should release the hostages that Hamas holds, B, enable a massive surge in humanitarian assistance and a ceasefire, move over to a phase two that should also then lead to a permanent end of hostilities in exchange for the rest of the hostages and Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and then into a phase three, which is a major multi-year reconstruction plan for Gaza and the transfer of any leftover remains of Israeli hostages. It also, of course, includes Palestinian prisoner releases as part of a hostage deal. But what this is basically a three-part ceasefire deal: phase one, phase two, phase three. And it's interesting because until the president made this pretty bold speech on Friday, it had felt like everything had become unmoored. The negotiators had tried to get to a ceasefire deal over the previous weeks. There was this moment where Hamas declared that they had agreed to a ceasefire deal, but they were agreeing to their own deal. And the Israelis rejected it, saying this wasn't the deal that we submitted. And then sort of there was chaos. There was the Israeli strike on two Hamas operatives that then burnt alive 45 Palestinians in a displaced persons camp near or in the Al Mawasi humanitarian area. And it very much felt that no one was really sure about what was going on. And the president made this intervention to say, look, the Israelis have made this offer, and now it is on everyone to push Hamas to accept this offer. And that's really been the tenor of the US administration, pushing Egypt and Qatar mainly as the main mediators and probably two of the closest countries towards Hamas's military and political leadership to put pressure on Hamas to come to the table, with the Americans playing the role of cajoling the Israelis to stick to their offer and not be pushed against political pressure. So that was really President Biden's statement. But it's important also to lay out, and we're recording today on Thursday, the 6th of June. John Feiner, the Deputy National Security Advisor, said just an hour ago at a think tank in DC, CNAS, that they see this ceasefire opportunity as an opening to help stabilize the region, calm things down on the northern border, and be an opening act to a potential normalization deal with Saudi. And so they're really pushing this as the opening salvo to everything else they want to do.
Why do you suspect it was Biden who, on Friday, in kind of a politically very interesting moment, this was a day after Trump's conviction, and this was going to be Biden's first major address to the press, address to the country, yet he opted to take the moment to release what he said was an Israeli proposal. What can you tell me about the timing and the optics and the political and diplomatic relevance of the fact that it was Biden ostensibly announcing Israel's proposal?
I mean, there's a few different ways to take this, but if we jump backwards, number one, this is a very high risk move for President Biden.
Indeed, I agree. Yeah.
And with high risk comes high reward. And I think that's important. The Biden administration didn't have to do this. And I think that the president deserves kudos for inserting himself very directly. And it is a big risk, not only because, he's presenting an Israeli proposal, but he's putting pressure on his regional allies to get Hamas to come to the table. And should either party reject this, the question is what happens next? What's his next move?
On this point, I mean, I know you conspicuously do not have an American accent, but you are very much an American football fan. This I know about you. Is this like the diplomatic equivalent of a Hail Mary?
I don't think it's a Hail Mary, but I think that there's a recognition we're in a 2-minute drill. We've run out of timeouts and you've got a minute and a half to get the ball down the field. And the question is, you can kick a field goal and go to extra time, and maybe that's okay. Or you could try and get a touchdown and win the game, which I think is the most rosy optimistic going from phase 1, 2, and 3, but we'll settle for overtime at this point. And so I think that's where we're up to rather than a Hail Mary. If this fails and then we've got like one last play, we'll figure out what that is. But, thank you for the football space. And I appreciate that. Go Bears. Very exciting season ahead of us. But the Biden administration presented this because both of internal Israeli political reasons and also just the geostrategic moment. I think after Hamas accepted their own proposal, it felt very much, when you sort of stick your finger into the wind of geopolitics, is that Israel was rejecting Hamas's proposal and they got to really take the agenda. And I think the president was like, look, I have cajoled what I think is a very reasonable proposal from the Israelis. And Hamas now needs to either get with the program or demonstrate that they're the ones blocking a ceasefire.
Mhm.
I think that his credibility and the president's credibility was important because I don't think the negotiators, either Israel had trust in the Arab negotiators or the Arab negotiators had trust in Israel. The Israelis are currently having a massive dispute with both Egypt and Qatar. Qatar for what Israel feels was its financing of Hamas, of which Doha says Israel told them to do it and has letters. And Egypt and Israel, the prime minister and the president have not spoken of Egypt and Israel since the beginning of October 7th. The
Mm.
Egyptians are convinced that the Israelis are trying to push the Gazans over the border. The Egyptians say that if you do that, that will be a fracture in our relationship. And when the Israelis took over the Philadelphia route and the Rafah border, the Egyptians say that that's breaching their agreements. The Israelis say that they have to take that over to prevent smuggling of Hamas. There's a big question about why Israel waited until now to do it, and that's a story for another time. But for many people, they felt that Israel was ready to make this offer that even in background, the administration has said is extremely similar to what Hamas had offered just a few weeks ago, because now Israel is in charge of that border crossing and can prevent smuggling
Mm.
and feels more confident in the prevention of Hamas being able to rearm itself. And that gives Israel confidence in order to move forward with this offer. But the Biden administration did it in order to give it the credibility internationally that sadly the Israeli government no longer has.
So there's been a lot discussed about Israel's reaction to this proposal, and we'll certainly discuss that at length. But I'm most interested in learning from you first. How has Hamas responded? I know initially I saw some news that they, quote unquote, welcomed the proposal, but there has not been a definitive acceptance of this three-phase proposal, the first phase of which I think is probably the most important, an immediate 6-week ceasefire. So what has Hamas done since this proposal by Biden last Friday?
Well, as of today, they haven't officially said no.
That's something.
Yes, and that's already a success. The proposal didn't trip over itself to start with, though they're claiming that they want clarifications. They've claimed that the US UN proposal to the Security Council that captures this ceasefire proposal doesn't do enough for them. So they're negotiating about negotiating to come in. But I think, what you just said in the introduction is interesting for you. And I think for many people, phase one's really important. Phase one is not important to Hamas. And I think that's very important. Hamas does not care about the livelihoods of Gazans. They have demonstrated that again and again.
Yeah.
The destruction of Gaza, the humanitarian suffering for them is worth it for their overall objective.
And they've been very explicit that, phase one is a temporary ceasefire. They don't want a temporary ceasefire. They want a
No,
full.
they want phase two. They want the
Yeah.
Israeli withdrawal and to survive. And there's a fundamental disagreement that Israel does not want Hamas to remain a governing entity, and Hamas does. Hamas wants to survive. They want to be the winners and the victors of this conflict. And victory for Hamas is not a destruction of Israel at this moment. I mean, their long term vision is the destruction of Israel. It's that Israel for 8 months tried to kill us and we didn't die. And if that means that Gaza is never reconstructed and that people have lost their livelihoods, okay, that's worth it in the service of the cause. And that's really challenging because what Israel looks like to victory is very different and a far narrower band of circumstances versus Hamas. And it also fits into the wider regional picture. The president has indicated this, and I think the region's indicated that Hamas's motivation for doing the October 7th massacre and atrocities was because they wanted to re-establish the Palestinian narrative on a global stage and kick away the concept of Israeli-Saudi normalization that was moving forward. And they feel like as long as they've galvanized the world against Israel and that they've hurt them, whatever damage is done to Gaza in the meantime is irrelevant to them.
Mm.
And so the question is, how can you even leverage Hamas to say yes? As I said, like Egypt and Doha have been hosting political meetings, or, Doha hosts the political leadership of Hamas, but Hamas's military leadership that is somewhere underground in Gaza feels very secure and in charge and doesn't really care what its political leadership thinks or wants. And so how you extract leverage is really a question. And the Israeli figuring is that you extract leverage through military pressure. And Hamas is like, look, if we can destroy Israel's international support and the fact that Israel is dependent on US supplies, and if we can destroy that, then we destroy Israeli deterrence against us because they can't do this ad infinitum given the condemnation, and then we survive. And so we'll hold out until we just get guarantees that phase two will happen. And if phase one doesn't happen, if more people die, well, that's it. The challenge of how you put pressure on is really complicated.
Like, are there opportunities for external actors, like specifically the United States, which has, a security partnerships with both Qatar and Egypt? Is there like a bank shot opportunity in which the US somehow squeezes Egypt or squeezes Qatar, and that trickles down into squeezing Hamas to accept this three-part deal?
I think that's the current aim and that's the challenge. And I think that, the Israelis have been pushing and Israel's allies have been pushing the administration to put more pressure on Doha, to put more pressure on Egypt to get this to happen. But the Americans look, we also have strategic relationships with these countries. And in addition, at what point is the leverage not working? Like, it's not Doha who's doing this. It's not Cairo who's doing this. It's Hamas. And the Americans don't really have leverage, for example, on Iran. And with everything heating up in the north with Hezbollah, now the Americans apparently are warning the Israelis that if they respond to ever increasing attacks on their northern border with a ground invasion, it could drag Iran into direct confrontation again with Israel and flood the Lebanese and Syria zone with thousands of pro-Iranian militias.
Yeah.
And Hamas is delighted. Hamas's entire desire is to get more people involved and to put more pressure on this.
It really does seem that we are at this unique moment in which we have never been closer in all these months to a ceasefire deal, while at the same time, we're also seemingly still on that precipice of a wider regional war, and things can tip one way or another any given moment.
100%. And I think that this is not the panic, but the worry that the administration has in order to try and keep everything moving forward. And notwithstanding, it's a horrendous, disgusting, unimaginable moment for any Gazan civilian, like non sequitur, like absolutely. And they're these horrendous victims who are victims of this terrible international geopolitical regional conflict. And the authorities in charge of them don't give two shits about them. And that's very difficult. And on the Israeli end, it's them recognizing the limits of their own power when they're dependent on others. And that's a very difficult moment.
Hamas, if I could very briefly summarize, the good news is they have not said no. The bad news is there are lots of pressures and incentives against them saying yes. So we have to navigate these very tricky next several days or weeks as these negotiations continue. What has been the reaction on the Israeli side of the ledger since last Friday, since Biden's speech?
There was first a tremendous amount of confusion about, was this an Israeli proposal?
Yeah.
Biden did this on a Friday morning, which was already Shabbat in Israel, so the news was really off, at least from the religious parties, until Saturday night. And there was a question, why is President Biden presenting an Israeli proposal and then asking Israel to accept its own proposal? The peanut gallery on Twitter and others are like, haha, see, Biden's so stupid, or this demonstrates malfeasance. It doesn't. It's very obvious to anyone who's been watching or reading that the Israeli cabinet is divided on this entire Gaza conflict. The Israeli war cabinet, which is made up of the defense minister Gallant, the prime minister Netanyahu, Benny Gantz, who is now Bibi's biggest rival, who joined as a unity government. Then technically there are two formal observers, Ron Dermer, the strategic affairs minister in Israel, Bibi's closest confidant, and Gadi Eisenkot, who is Gantz's confidant, and then Aryeh Deri, who is the head of Shas, sits there but isn't technically there.
And Shas is one of the right-wing religious parties.
Well, yeah, they're one of the ultra-Orthodox parties.
Yeah.
And so this was actually the deal that they had submitted to the US, but they weren't making public. And the reason they weren't making it public is that Bibi often likes to not make decisions. Like, if you ask lots of observers, one thing about the prime minister is that he doesn't like to actually make a decision and to keep his options open. And there was a worry in the US and others that if he was pushed by his political right, namely the finance minister Smotrich and the public security minister Ben-Gvir, that they will not accept any deal and that he will fold on that because if they leave the government, he no longer has a majority. And so the administration decides, say, look, this is an Israeli deal and they need to move forward. And that sort of trapped Bibi into his own deal and to have to try and get it through his own system.
So it was clever. It was a clever move by the Biden administration.
It was a clever move by the administration, and one that, by the way, I don't know if it wasn't coordinated with the Israelis. I mean, there's some reports that they weren't informed, there were some reports that they were informed, but it was their deal. And there was a question about how did Biden describe the shift from phase one to phase two? When does the negotiations begin? Can you break it off if both sides don't agree? All the technical details, but fundamentally, this was their deal. And so, as expected, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich said that they will abandon the government if this moves forward. Importantly, UTJ, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, and Shas, the Sephardi ultra-Orthodox party, back the deal. And most of the Likud MKs and ministers have stayed silent, which is normally the indication that Bibi is telling them not to trash the deal, which means that he's on board. But the Israelis are like, look, we will respond positively, officially, 100%, when Hamas says we respond officially 100%, because their hope is that Bibi can avoid the political nightmare for himself. If Hamas says no, then he's got nothing to worry about his coalition collapsing. If Hamas says yes, then he'll go and he'll deal with the political consequences. So each side now is like, you hang up, no, you hang up, like, well, you call, no, I'll call. It's this absurdity that we're negotiating to go into the negotiations. And the worry is the regional environment is heating up extremely. And it's, of course, heating up extremely because if the Biden administration wants to use this as the opening to something bigger, which goes back to normalization, which the Iranians do not want, and that Hezbollah do not want, and that Hamas does not want, the aim would be to try and limp into the ceasefire rather than celebrate going to the ceasefire in order to cap its potential about what it could achieve. Because then if it's just capped at 6 weeks, then we don't have to worry about the wider issues that the region is divided on. And I'll say this, I spoke before about Hamas's victory conditions being a very wide band, just survival. The Israeli victory conditions are completely unclear. Since day one, it has been unclear to everyone about what total victory, which is what Netanyahu likes to say, actually means. The best definition has been that Hamas cannot militarily threaten Israel and cannot govern Gaza. Okay, but then what comes next? And the Israeli inability to define a day after that includes the Palestinian Authority or something else has been the albatross around Israel's neck and has led to so many in the region and internationally doubting Israeli intentions about what they see as a just war. And because of that, the boundary of what victory looks like looks almost impossible from the Israeli perspective. And if it's impossible, some say, like the hostage families, just agree, get the hostages back, and like we'll lick our wounds and figure out what comes next. And others are like, no, we cannot have a deterrence if we've lost, and we can't survive without deterrence, and so we need to crush them. And what does crushing them even look like? And it's unclear. And that is the entire context that the entire West is struggling. Like, what do we do? Like, do we remove arms from Israel? Like, how do we get them off this perch? And if we remove arms and they continue to move forward, what's the next stage? And what's the next stage?
I mean, it did seem that Biden sought to give the Israelis an out when in his speech, he firmly declared that Hamas has been degraded to the point where they can never carry out a kind of attack like October 7th. He seemed to like nudge Israel to the position of like, take the win here. You guys did it.
Yeah, the Biden administration is like, look, this is what winning looks like. I'm sorry it's not what you feel like it looks like, but this is as good as it's going to get. And the more you wait, the worse you go. Like, eventually this war will end. You can either end it with a potential pathway to still normalize with Saudi Arabia, or you can end it with nothing. And you can get hostages back right now, which is the main dividing line that's taken over the judicial protests in Israel. The main dividing line in Israel is, do you prioritize hostage release or do you not? And it's reflecting the schisms in Israeli society that have existed. So Biden is very much trying to, in probably his own mind, save Israel from its own worst instincts. And this is something, as he's repeated, that he said a week into the war when he visited Israel, where he said, look, learn our lessons from 9/11. Don't make the same mistakes we did. And it seems like Israel has not currently heeded that message. And to be fair, and I think this is also important, there's the geostrategic realpolitik argument and thing around that. And there's also the emotional trauma. And on the Israeli side, it's very hard to advance someone through emotional trauma very, very quickly and get them to the other side. Like, we are now still within the first year of what for Israel was multiple 9/11s. And if we remember our own country after 9/11 and the legislation and the military actions we took, it took a while for the country to sort of reset itself and sort of emotionally deal with the trauma of that day. Now, this has nothing to say of how Gazan society is ever going to deal with the trauma of what's happened to them over the past 8 months. I don't know. And I've got no clue. Hamas doesn't care, which is their advantage. The Israeli society has to care because it's still a democracy and it still elects its leadership. And how it deals with that is really tough. And so the Biden administration is trying desperately to push Israel through these stages of grief to sort of acceptance as quickly as possible because it can see down the line how dangerous it is if Israel doesn't take this off ramp.
So there has been this notion hanging throughout this conflict that the moment there is a ceasefire, Netanyahu's political grip on power collapses. And with his loosening of political power comes also potential criminal proceedings against him for stuff that happened related to campaign finance issues. How does this proposal thread that needle? And does it sort of advance that kind of question that the moment a ceasefire is reached, that Netanyahu loses power?
The Israeli coalition is made up of 64 members of the Knesset. Plus, you've got Benny Gantz, who has brought in his members in order to have this emergency government. So here's the deal. On June 8th, which is 2 days, Gantz declared that as a deadline for the government of Israel to come up with a strategy and what's called a commission of national inquiry, or he's going to leave the coalition. And should he leave the coalition can still survive. It's down to 64. The administration does not want Gantz and Eisenkot out of the coalition. They want them in. They see them as moderating forces. So that was political incentive number one. Now, if Ben Gvir and Smotrich leave, that takes the coalition down significantly. I think they have together 12 seats. So they definitely lose their majority and Gantz doesn't make up the difference. So given that, Bibi would lose a governing majority. However, the leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, has said that he would act as a safety net to get the hostage deal through. And already 70 members of the Knesset have already signed a letter saying that they would support Biden's hostage deal. So there's a majority of it within the 120 member Knesset. Now, in addition, there is a stalking horse of the coalition that has nothing to do with Gaza, which is to do with the draft bill about bringing the ultra-Orthodox into the army. The Supreme Court ordered the government to put forward a proposal, and the government can't put forward a proposal because Gantz and the defense minister Gallant has said that they won't support anything that all factions won't support. And Gantz wants an equality of burden to bring the ultra-Orthodox in. The Supreme Court already had hearings on this past week where they rejected the government's private attorney's attempt to say that this isn't possible to do and that this is a matter of life and death. The right-wing justices even said that's pretty audacious to say when you've got actual people doing life or death stuff in Gaza. So basically what this means is Bibi is facing an existential threat to his coalition because if they don't pass a draft bill, then all of the subsidies to the ultra-Orthodox religious schools and yeshiva end. And if they end, then possibly the ultra-Orthodox will leave anyway and collapse the coalition. So when Bibi looks around and says, what are my options here? He can either say no to Biden, keep Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and just keep the coalition together and then deal with those circumstances. That's one. He can, two, say, look, I'll take the deal, but Smotrich, Ben Gvir don't leave. We're never going to get to phase two anyway. And look, we can all celebrate the return of hostages and then get back to the war. That's option two. Option three is, okay, like there's, at the moment of choice to move from phase one and phase two, the Israelis are convinced to move forward for cajoling and everything else, and that he enjoys the support of the rest of the Knesset, and the government limps along until the end of the deal, and then Bibi runs on the basis of, I delivered the deal, and I'm the only one who can stand up against the Palestinian state, and whatever else it is he wants to run on. Or option four, the government could collapse on the basis of the ultra-Orthodox issues, which is incredibly unpopular in Israel, and then they go to elections over that. So the coalition is besieged, and what Bibi has to do is the summer session of the Knesset ends in a couple of weeks. If he can make it to the end of the summer session, then the Knesset won't be dissolved, and then his coalition can survive at least until the winter session. And then when you're in the winter session, it can be a problem for that day. So the Israeli political scene is both incredibly stable at 64, as long as they don't change tact. If they do agree with Biden, it will create a political dynamic which will force a change. And then Bibi no longer controls his own fate of when an election will and won't be called. And part of that is Biden's stress, and part of that is the stress of the ultra Orthodox enlistment bill. And so it's complicated. And this is something that Israel, as a democracy, has to deal with at a time of war. And that's very, very difficult, as the country every day still is having demonstrations. The hostage families are leading demonstrations for the ceasefire deal now to save their loved ones.
Well, that was a very comprehensive answer, Joel. I appreciate it.
Look, I'd say, Mark, I listen to Global Dispatches. I love it. And it's a very informed bunch of folks. Don't fall into the simplistic understandings of either party on this conflict. The complexity shouldn't freeze us, but understanding the nuance and complexity is important because it tells us what is politically possible. Virtue signaling isn't policy. It can inform policy, but it isn't policy. And understanding the motivations is really important. And I know that everyone now is once again re-engaged on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but for a long time, a lot of the DC and policy establishment ignored it, or now they're coming back to it with previous iterations when they were dealing with it in the early noughties or in the 90s. And it's just a completely different society on both sides. And understanding that complexity is essential if we're going to find a way out of this terrible, terrible situation.
Well, I appreciate you helping to disentangle some of the complexities. Thank you, Joel.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.